Beirut, Lebanon, April 9, 1973. The Mediterranean washes against the Corniche as the city sleeps under a starry sky. Along the waterfront stand like sentinels the elite apartment buildings, their balconies overlooking a sea that has witnessed the rise and fall of empires. In the prestigious Verdun district, home to diplomats and politicians, the streets are empty. The only sounds are the distant crash of waves on rocks and the occasional patrol of a security guard. This is the stage for one of the most audacious special operations in modern history, a mission born from tragedy and executed with chilling precision. Tonight, a message will be delivered, not with words, but with fire and resolve. The target is the very heart of the organization that struck Israel where it hurt most, and the method of delivery will be as unexpected as it is devastating. Inside a white Mercedes sedan parked 2 blocks from the waterfront, 4 figures sit in absolute silence. They wear elegant evening gowns, their hair styled in the fashionable cuts of early 1970s Beirut society. Their makeup is flawless, applied with the care of women who understand that looking wealthy and confident is as much about inner bearing as outward appearance. To any passerby, they would appear as society ladies returning from a late dinner party, perhaps waiting for husbands finishing cigars and brandy in some exclusive club. But beneath their dresses, strapped to their thighs and concealed in specially modified handbags, each carries a silenced pistol, plastic explosives, and enough ammunition to fight their way out of a building full of armed guards. These are not women at all, but some of Israel's most elite commandos. Men trained in hand-to-hand combat, demolition, surveillance, and the psychological discipline required to operate deep within enemy territory while maintaining covers that could collapse from a single mistake. They are operators from Sayeret Matkal, Israel's most secretive special forces unit, the organization that would later produce prime ministers and legendary military commanders. Tonight, they are executing the final phase of an operation months in the planning, requiring coordination of intelligence assets across 3 continents, and constituting Israel's direct response to the most traumatic terrorist attack in the young nation's history. 5 months earlier, on September 5, 1972, the world watched in horror as Palestinian terrorists from the Black September organization stormed the apartments of the Israeli Olympic team in Munich, Germany. The assault resulted in the deaths of 11 Israeli athletes and coaches, transforming what should have been a celebration of international sport into a blood-soaked demonstration that nowhere was safe, that terrorism could strike anywhere in the world at any time with devastating effect. The Munich Massacre shook Israel to its core. The victims were not soldiers or spies who accepted risk as part of their profession, but athletes, swimmers, wrestlers, weightlifters, young people representing their country in peaceful competition. Their deaths were felt as a violation not only of Israel's security, but of basic human decency, proof that Palestinian militant organizations would kill anyone, anywhere, to achieve their political aims. Israeli Prime Minister Golda Meir convened an emergency session of her security cabinet within hours of the massacre ending. The meeting lasted through the night as intelligence chiefs, military commanders, and political leaders debated how Israel should respond. Some argued for immediate, visible military action, airstrikes against Palestinian training camps in Lebanon and Syria that would demonstrate Israeli resolve and exact a price for terrorism. Others insisted on covert retribution, targeted assassinations that would decapitate the Black September leadership while sending an unambiguous message that attacks on Israel carried permanent consequences. Ultimately, Mossad was authorized to conduct a comprehensive campaign combining both approaches. The Israeli Air Force would strike known militant facilities, satisfying public demand for an immediate, visible response. But the more significant operation would be a secret, systematic campaign to hunt down and eliminate everyone involved in planning, funding, and executing the Munich attack. The operation was codenamed Wrath of God, and it would become one of the most extensive targeted killing campaigns in modern intelligence history. Mossad was tasked with identifying targets, tracking their movements, and coordinating with Sayeret Matkal to carry out the eliminations. The criteria were clear. Anyone who played a significant role in Munich would be marked for death, no matter where they lived, how well protected they were, or how long it took to reach them. The campaign would continue until every name on the list was crossed off. Whether it took months or years, the intelligence gathering began immediately. Mossad officers in European capitals debriefed witnesses, studied evidence from the crime scene collected by German investigators, and sifted through communications intercepts that signals intelligence units had gathered in the months preceding Munich. A picture emerged of an operation planned in Beirut, funded through networks linked to Palestine Liberation Organization offices in European capitals, and carried out by operatives trained in Lebanon and Jordan. 3 names rose to the top of the target list. Mohammed Youssef al-Najjar, a senior PLO official responsible for Black September's finances and logistics. Al-Najjar maintained an apartment in Beirut's Verdun district and moved with minimal security, apparently confident his political standing would shield him from Israeli reprisal. Kamal Adwan, responsible for Black September operations in the West Bank and inside Israel itself, the man who coordinated the infiltration of operatives into Israeli territory to carry out attacks on civilian targets. And Kamal Nasser, the official PLO spokesman and a prominent poet, whose eloquent advocacy for Palestinian resistance made him the public voice of the movement, and whose links to the Black September leadership made him complicit in the organization's terrorist operations. For Israeli planners, these 3 men represented the operational and political core of Black September. Eliminating them would decapitate key elements of the organization's leadership, disrupt its financial networks, and demonstrate that planning attacks on Israel carried fatal consequences regardless of political standing or cultural significance. The inclusion of Nasser, a poet and spokesman rather than a pure operative, signaled that Israel drew no distinction between those who pulled triggers and those who provided the ideological justification and public propaganda for terrorism. But killing them would not be easy. All 3 lived in Beirut, a city where Palestinian organizations maintained an armed presence, where Lebanese security services monitored foreign intelligence activity, and where any Israeli action risked provoking a wider military confrontation with Lebanon or Syria. Traditional assassination methods, car bombs or shootings in public places, would likely kill bystanders and trigger a political backlash that could undermine the operation's strategic goals. Israeli military intelligence proposed an alternative approach, so audacious it seemed impossible. Instead of sending individual assassins to eliminate the targets one by one over months or years, they would conduct a single coordinated raid, inserting a large commando force into Beirut, striking all 3 targets simultaneously, and evacuating before Lebanese security forces could mount an effective response. The plan required absolute timing precision, flawless intelligence on the target's locations and security measures, and operational secrecy so tight that not even a hint of the impending operation could leak to Palestinian intelligence networks or Lebanese authorities. Any failure would turn the mission from a surgical strike into a suicide operation, with Israeli commandos trapped inside a hostile city facing overwhelming opposition. Mossad assigned the intelligence-gathering task to officers working under diplomatic cover in European capitals and deep cover agents embedded within Beirut's Palestinian society. Over 3 months, they compiled details on the target's daily routines, security measures, apartment layouts, and the locations of guard posts and surveillance systems. They identified the building where each target lived, mapped escape routes, and pinpointed the exact spots where the commando teams would need to position themselves to ensure clean kills without excessive collateral damage. The emerging intelligence picture was both encouraging and daunting. All 3 targets lived in the Verdun and Hamra districts, elite neighborhoods populated by wealthy Lebanese and foreign diplomats. The buildings were modern, maintained by lobbies and concierge services, but not fortified compounds designed to resist a military assault. The targets maintained relatively light security, apparently believing that operating openly in Beirut provided protection through visibility rather than armed guards and hardened positions. Al-Najjar lived on the first floor of a building on Rue Verdun with his wife and children. He employed no bodyguards, relying on the building's concierge and his own caution for protection. Adwan occupied an apartment a few blocks away with similar security measures. Nasser lived in the same residential complex as the others. His apartment served as both a home and a workspace where he composed the poems and speeches that articulated Palestinian grievances to Arab and international audiences. The planners concluded a raid was feasible if executed with stunning speed and surprise. The commandos would need to reach the target's apartments, eliminate them, and evacuate to waiting vehicles before Lebanese police or Palestinian militias could mount effective resistance. The entire operation, from landing to evacuation, had to occur in under 2 hours, with the actual assault phase lasting no more than 20 minutes. The assignment went to Sayeret Matkal. The unit was formed in 1957 as Israel's answer to the British SAS, designed for deep penetration raids, hostage rescue, and the elimination of high-value targets on hostile territory. Its operators were selected from the most elite combat units in Israel, subjected to additional screening for intelligence, psychological resilience, and the ability to operate independently under extreme stress. They trained constantly in close-quarters combat, demolition, languages, and the kind of improvisational problem-solving characteristic of special operations where plans meet reality. The unit commander assembled a strike force of 40 operators, divided into several teams, each with specific responsibilities. Assault teams would enter the target buildings and carry out the killings. Support teams would provide perimeter security, preventing interference from Palestinian guards or Lebanese police. A command element would coordinate timing and manage contingencies if the operation deviated from plan. Crucially, an intelligence team would infiltrate Beirut days before the raid to conduct final surveillance and set up safe houses where the strike force could prepare immediately before the attack. Training began in November 1972. At a secret facility in the desert, Israeli military engineers constructed full-scale mock-ups of the target buildings based on architectural plans Mossad obtained through sources in Beirut's construction industry. The mock-ups replicated everything: lobby layouts, elevator systems, door configurations, apartment interiors, even the placement of furniture within the living spaces based on photographs taken by surveillance teams. The teams rehearsed the raid dozens of times, drilling until every movement was automatic. They practiced in darkness, with smoke obscuring visibility, with simulated mechanical failures forcing them to adapt plans in real time. They drilled medical evacuation procedures for wounded operators, communication protocols if radios failed, and contingency plans should Lebanese security forces respond faster than expected. One element of the plan was particularly unusual and required extensive preparation. The initial infiltration would involve commandos disguised as women, wearing evening gowns and wigs, made up to resemble wealthy Lebanese or European women returning from social events. The disguise served several purposes. Beirut in 1973 was a cosmopolitan city where European and Arab elites mingled freely, where women in elegant evening attire were a common sight near expensive restaurants and nightclubs. Commandos dressed this way would attract less attention than armed men in tactical gear. More importantly, the disguise would facilitate access to residential buildings, where concierges and guards were trained to scrutinize suspicious men, but rarely questioned well-dressed women entering a lobby. The commandos selected for this role underwent training that would have seemed absurd had the stakes not been so high. They practiced walking in women's shoes, learned to carry themselves with the posture and manners characteristic of affluent women rather than soldiers, and studied how to apply makeup convincingly enough to pass inspection by building guards who might look closely. Israeli intelligence brought in consultants, women versed in fashion and social behavior, to critique the commandos' presentations and ensure nothing in their appearance or demeanor would arouse suspicion during the critical moments when they entered the target buildings. By March 1973, planning was complete and the force was ready. Israeli intelligence confirmed all 3 targets would be in Beirut during the first week of April, a rare convergence that might not recur for months. Prime Minister Meir gave final approval on April 5. The operation, codenamed Spring of Youth, was set for the night of April 9. The infiltration began on April 7, when the intelligence team entered Lebanon via the northern border posing as European tourists. They drove to Beirut in rented cars, checked into a hotel using forged passports, and spent the next 2 days conducting final surveillance on the target buildings and arranging the safe houses where the assault force would assemble just before the raid. The main assault force would arrive by sea. On the evening of April 9, Israeli missile boats sailed from Haifa carrying Zodiac rubber boats and the 40 commandos who would execute the raid. The boats would approach the Lebanese coast after dark, launching the Zodiacs 3 kilometers offshore to avoid radar detection, with the commandos landing on a beach north of Beirut where Mossad had arranged waiting vehicles. The maritime approach was chosen specifically because Lebanese authorities monitored border crossings and the airport with sufficient thoroughness that infiltrating 40 armed men by land or air would be detected. The sea offered the only viable route for inserting a force large enough to conduct multiple simultaneous assaults while maintaining tactical surprise. At 22:00 hours on April 9, the missile boats reached the launch point. The sea was calm, conditions nearly ideal for the Zodiac landing. The commandos, already dressed in their operational gear with evening gowns and wigs packed in waterproof bags, boarded the boats and began the approach to shore. They reached the beach at 22:45 hours without incident, dragged the Zodiacs into vegetation where they would be hidden until evacuation, and moved to the vehicles waiting on the coastal road. The vehicles were a mix of rented sedans and locally sourced cars Mossad had arranged through assets in Beirut's criminal underworld. Nothing about them suggested a military operation. They looked like ordinary civilian cars that would blend with Beirut's night traffic without attracting notice. The commandos changed into their disguises during the drive into the city, transforming from obvious soldiers into convincing likenesses of wealthy women and their male companions returning from evening social events. By 23:30 hours, all teams had reached their designated positions a few blocks from the target buildings. The assault leaders synchronized watches, confirmed communications were functional, and reviewed the sequence one last time. The attacks were to begin simultaneously at exactly midnight, ensuring no target would be warned by hearing gunfire from another location. The team assigned to Mohammed Youssef al-Najjar consisted of 6 operators. 4 would enter the building disguised as women, moving through the lobby with a confidence that suggested they belonged there. 2 would remain outside in a car, providing security and ready to evacuate the assault team the moment the killing was complete. At 23:55 hours, the 4 commandos dressed as women stepped from their Mossad and walked toward al-Najjar's building. They moved with rehearsed ease, laughing and speaking in Arabic about an imaginary dinner party they had just attended. The building's night concierge glanced at them through the glass doors, but made no move to intercept. Wealthy women entering residential buildings late at night were an unremarkable sight in this neighborhood. He returned his attention to the small television on his desk. The women entered the lobby, walked to the elevator, and pressed the button for the first floor where al-Najjar's apartment was located. As soon as the elevator doors closed, they dropped the pretense. Hands reached into handbags, extracting silenced pistols and plastic explosive charges. By the time the doors opened on the first floor, they had transformed from society ladies into a precision killing team. Al-Najjar's apartment was the 3rd door on the left. One operator approached the door and began working on the lock, while the others took up covering positions, guarding the corridor. The lock quickly yielded to tools designed specifically for this purpose. The door opened silently, and the team moved inside. The apartment was dark and quiet, al-Najjar asleep in a bedroom with his wife. The team moved through the apartment with practiced efficiency, confirming the layout matched their intelligence. They reached the bedroom door, and one operator slowly turned the handle. Al-Najjar awoke as the door opened. His instincts sensed something wrong before his eyes had adjusted to see the armed figures entering his sleeping chamber. He began to rise, possibly reaching for a weapon he kept in a nightstand drawer, but he was too late. The first silenced shot struck him in the chest and head, killing him instantly. His wife began to scream, a sound that would alert neighbors and compress the timeline for evacuation. The commandos did not hesitate. They placed explosive charges on documents and materials scattered around the apartment, items that might contain intelligence value on Black September operations. The charges were small, designed to destroy paper without collapsing walls or causing excessive collateral damage. They set 2-minute timers and moved back toward the apartment door. In the hallway, they encountered al-Najjar's teenage son, awakened by his mother's screams. The boy stood frozen, staring at the armed figures in women's clothing who had just killed his father. In a moment that stretched impossibly long, the lead operator weighed his options. The boy was not a target. Killing him would violate the rules of engagement that distinguished combatants from civilians. But leaving him alive risked him alerting the building's security before the team could evacuate. The operator made a decision that would haunt him for years after. He struck the boy hard across the temple with his pistol, a blow calculated to render him unconscious without causing permanent injury. The boy collapsed, and the team moved quickly toward the elevator, aware that every second of delay exponentially increased the risk. They reached the lobby just as the explosive charges detonated upstairs. The muffled thumps caused the concierge to look up, alarmed. The team burst through the lobby doors and ran to their waiting Mossad. By the time the concierge realized what was happening and reached for the telephone to call the police, they were already speeding away from the building. The assault on Kamal Adwan's apartment followed a similar pattern with one critical difference. Adwan was not asleep when the team entered his apartment. He was working late, reviewing papers at a desk in his study, when he heard his apartment door being breached. Unlike al-Najjar, Adwan was armed and trained, a former militant who had participated in operations before transitioning to administrative and planning roles. As the team moved through his apartment, Adwan grabbed a rifle from a closet and took cover behind furniture in his study. When the first operator entered the room, Adwan fired. The shot hit the doorframe and forced the team to pull back and reassess the situation. They were now in a firefight inside a residential building, exactly the scenario planners had hoped to avoid. The team leader made a quick decision. They could not afford a protracted gun battle that would give Lebanese security forces time to respond. He signaled for two operators to provide suppressive fire through the doorway while he moved onto the apartment's balcony, intending to approach Adwan from an unexpected angle. The operator climbed over the balcony railing and moved laterally along the building's exterior. Finding handholds in decorative masonry, the architects never intended to support a man's weight. He reached the window of Adwan's study, and using a brief moment when Adwan was focused on the doorway where his teammates were firing, smashed the glass and shot Adwan several times at point-blank range. The entire firefight lasted less than 2 minutes but was loud. The unsilenced rifle shots and the sound of breaking glass alerted the entire building and nearby streets that something violent was happening. The team grabbed documents from Adwan's desk, set explosive charges, and moved toward evacuation, knowing their window for a clean escape was rapidly closing. They reached their car and drove off just as residents began appearing on balconies and in doorways trying to understand what had happened. Lebanese police would later report receiving several emergency calls about gunfire and explosions in the Verdun district, but the first patrol cars would not arrive for another 8 minutes. By then, the commandos were already moving toward the evacuation point. The assault on Kamal Nasser's apartment presented unique problems. Unlike the others, Nasser was a public figure whose face was known throughout the Arab world through his television appearances and poetry readings. His apartment served as both a home and an office, a space where he met with journalists, comrades, poets, and political activists seeking his counsel or endorsement. Intelligence indicated he often worked late into the night, writing speeches and composing poems that gave voice to Palestinian aspirations. The team assigned to Nasser consisted of 6 operators who approached his building with the same disguised confidence as the others. They entered the lobby without incident, the concierge barely glancing at the elegantly dressed women who moved toward the elevator. But once they ascended to Nasser's floor, they received a short radio transmission from the team evacuating from al-Najjar's location. Time was compressing, the first explosions had already occurred, and Lebanese police were bound to respond within minutes. The commandos reached Nasser's door and made a quick assessment that subtlety was no longer an option. They placed a small explosive charge on the lock mechanism and stepped aside as it detonated with a sharp crack that echoed down the corridor. The door swung inward, and the team burst into the apartment. Nasser was in his study, surrounded by books and papers, a typewriter on the desk before him. He was working on a poem when the blast occurred. As the team swarmed into the room, he stood and looked at them with a dignity that surprised several of the operators. He did not reach for a weapon or attempt to flee. He simply stood, looked at the armed figures in women's clothing, and seemed to understand immediately what was happening. One of the commandos later recalled Nasser speaking in Arabic, asking if they were Israelis. When no one answered, he gave a slight nod as if confirming what he already knew. The lead operator fired 3 silenced shots. Nasser fell backward across his desk, scattering papers and knocking the typewriter to the floor. An unfinished poem remained in the machine, its final lines incomplete. The team moved quickly through the apartment, gathering documents and papers that might contain intelligence value. They found correspondence with PLO officials, draft speeches, and notebooks filled with observations on Palestinian politics and strategy. They set explosive charges to destroy what they could not carry and moved toward evacuation. As they exited the building, one of the operators noticed blood on his evening gown where he had brushed against Nasser's desk. The absurdity of the moment struck him profoundly. A professional killer disguised as a woman, covered in the blood of a poet whose words had inspired millions, but whose links to terrorism had marked him for death. This contradiction would stay with him for decades. The 3 teams converged on the evacuation route, maneuvering through Beirut's residential neighborhoods as the city behind them descended into chaos. Police sirens wailed in several directions. Military units mobilized from barracks across the city, and at PLO headquarters, commanders received frantic messages that 3 senior officials had been killed simultaneously in coordinated attacks bearing unmistakable Israeli signatures. The beach where the Zodiacs waited was 20 minutes north of Verdun under normal traffic conditions. But Beirut at midnight, with police alerts spreading across the city and military checkpoints being established at major intersections, was not normal conditions. The drivers chose circuitous routes through residential neighborhoods, avoiding main roads where Lebanese security forces were most likely to set up roadblocks. They reached the coastal road at 45 hours and turned north, accelerating as fast as they dared without attracting attention. Behind them, Beirut plunged into controlled chaos. Police cars with wailing sirens converged on the Verdun district. Military units mobilized from barracks. And in PLO offices across the city, commanders received frantic messages that Israeli commandos had just killed senior Palestinian officials in the heart of Beirut. The Zodiacs were where they had been left, hidden in vegetation above the tide line. The commandos quickly loaded their equipment and prepared for the short journey back to the missile boats waiting at sea. They pushed off at 105 hours, the small outboard motors barely audible over the sound of waves breaking on the beach. The missile boats held position 3 kilometers offshore, their crews monitoring Lebanese military radio frequencies and prepared to provide covering fire if the evacuation went wrong. When the Zodiacs appeared on radar at 112 hours, precisely on schedule, the relief among the naval crews was palpable. The teams had executed one of the most audacious raids in Israeli military history and were coming home. By 145 hours, all personnel and equipment were aboard the missile boats, and the small flotilla turned west, increasing speed once they were outside Lebanese territorial waters. The commandos removed their disguises, the evening gowns and wigs that had served their purpose and would now be disposed of at sea. They cleaned their weapons, conducted after-action assessments, and began processing the adrenaline and emotional aftermath of killing men in their bedrooms and workspaces while families and colleagues slept nearby. The boats reached Haifa at 630 hours on April 10. Prime Minister Meir waited on the dock alongside Defense Minister Moshe Dayan and Chief of Staff David Elazar. They congratulated the commandos personally, praising their professionalism and the successful execution of an operation that sent an unambiguous message about Israel's resolve in the face of terrorism. But the repercussions of the operation extended far beyond the immediate deaths of al-Najjar, Adwan, and Nasser. The raid humiliated Lebanese security forces, demonstrating they could not prevent Israeli operations even in the heart of their capital. It exposed Palestinian organizations as vulnerable despite their armed presence in Lebanon and their confident rhetoric about confronting Israeli power. And it set a precedent that would shape a decade of Israeli counterterrorism operations. A willingness to carry out bold military actions in foreign countries regardless of diplomatic consequences when Israeli leadership deemed such actions necessary for national security. The international reaction was swift and predictable. Arab governments condemned the raid as state terrorism and a violation of Lebanese sovereignty. The United Nations Security Council passed a resolution condemning Israel's actions and calling for restraint. Western governments issued cautious statements expressing concern about escalation, while often acknowledging that Israel had responded to Munich in ways that demonstrated both capability and restraint. Targeted killings of individuals directly responsible for terrorism rather than indiscriminate military strikes that would have killed Lebanese civilians. The raid accelerated political dynamics that would ultimately contribute to civil war in Lebanon. Lebanese Christians, who had long resented the armed Palestinian presence in their country, saw the Israeli operation as proof that Palestinian organizations brought conflict onto Lebanese soil without providing commensurate benefits. Palestinian factions saw the raid as evidence they needed stronger military capabilities and deeper integration into Lebanese society to protect themselves from Israeli operations. The death of Kamal Nasser, in particular, resonated across the Arab world in a way the deaths of al-Najjar and Adwan did not. Nasser was a cultural figure, a poet whose verses were taught in schools and recited at gatherings throughout the Middle East. His killing made him a martyr for Palestinian cultural resistance. His unfinished poem became a symbol of life and aspiration, cut short by violence. Palestinian intellectuals mourned him not only as a political ally, but as an artist whose voice gave beauty and eloquence to their struggle. Israeli officials defended Nasser's inclusion on the target list, emphasizing his role as a PLO spokesman and his links to the Black September leadership. They argued he was not merely a poet, but a propagandist whose words provided ideological justification for terrorism, making him complicit in violence even if he never personally pulled a trigger. This argument convinced few outside Israel, but reflected the Israeli government's position that the war against terrorism extended to those who provided intellectual and cultural support for attacks on Israeli civilians. The men who participated in the Beirut raid would carry its psychological weight for the rest of their lives. Some later spoke publicly about the moral complexity of killing men in front of their families, about the teenager one operator knocked unconscious, about the screams of a wife that followed them from al-Najjar's apartment. The operator who killed Nasser described the surreal experience of shooting a man who met death with calm dignity, whose final moments were spent surrounded by books and poetry rather than weapons and operational plans. They defended the operation's necessity while acknowledging its human cost, the perpetual burden of ending lives in pursuit of state objectives they believed justified, but which nonetheless required them to live with what they had done. The blood on the evening gown became a recurring image in one operator's nightmares, a visual representation of the collision between the absurdity of the disguise and the brutal reality of killing. Ali Hassan Salameh, the Red Prince and mastermind of Munich, was not among the targets that night. He remained on Mossad's list and would survive until 1979, when Israeli intelligence finally caught up with him in Beirut, killing him with a car bomb that also killed several bystanders. That operation lacked the precision of the 1973 raid, but it achieved its goal of eliminating a target who had evaded justice for years. His death closed a chapter in the post-Munich campaign of retribution, but did not end the broader cycle of violence between Israel and Palestinian organizations. The Spring of Youth raid became legendary in Israeli military and intelligence circles, studied as an example of operational audacity and meticulous planning. The image of commandos disguised as women moving through Beirut streets and apartment lobbies before revealing their true purpose and eliminating their targets with clinical efficiency captured something essential about special operations. The intersection of deception, violence, and a willingness to take extraordinary risks in pursuit of strategic objectives. Years later, one participant reflected on the operation in an interview with Israeli military historians. He described the surreal experience of applying makeup and walking in women's shoes, while preparing to kill men he had never met but whom intelligence assessments identified as responsible for murdering Israeli athletes or providing support to those who did. He spoke of the psychological discipline required to maintain a cover while moving toward lethal action, the compartmentalization necessary to function effectively on such an operation. He acknowledged the operation's success in tactical terms, the elimination of 3 high-value targets and the intelligence materials extracted from their apartments, but also expressed ambivalence about whether such operations ultimately served Israeli interests or simply perpetuated cycles of retaliation neither side could stop. The question remained unanswered, as it does for all such operations where tactical success and strategic wisdom do not necessarily align. The killing of Kamal Nasser illustrated this tension especially sharply. His death removed an eloquent voice of Palestinian resistance, but also created a martyr whose memory would inspire a future generation. The poetry he left unfinished became more powerful in its incompleteness than anything he might have written had he survived. The raid demonstrated that Israel possessed the capability and the will to cross borders and strike enemies wherever they felt safe. It established deterrence, making clear that planning attacks on Israel carried fatal consequences regardless of geographical distance or political protection. But it also revealed the limitation of kinetic responses to terrorism, that killing individual leaders does not destroy the ideologies and grievances that spawn new leaders to replace those eliminated. The commandos who disguised themselves as women and walked the streets of Beirut that April night became part of a larger narrative about Israeli exceptionalism in military operations, a willingness to attempt missions other nations considered too risky or unconventional. The operation entered the pantheon of legendary Israeli special operations, alongside the Entebbe raid, the destruction of Iraq's nuclear reactor, and the capture of Adolf Eichmann. Each demonstrated tactical brilliance while raising questions about whether such actions served long-term strategic interests or merely demonstrated capability without achieving sustainable security. What remains undeniable is that on the night of April 9, 1973, Israeli commandos proved that innovation in military operations could overcome numerical disadvantages and geographical constraints when combined with meticulous planning, rigorous training, and the kind of operational audacity that defines special operations at their most effective. The evening gowns and wigs became symbols of that audacity, a reminder that the evolution of warfare often depends on creativity as much as on firepower, and that sometimes the most effective disguise is the one no one expects. The three men killed that night, al-Najjar with his financial networks, Adwan with his operational planning, and Nasser with his eloquent advocacy, represented different facets of the Palestinian resistance movement. Their simultaneous elimination demonstrated Israeli intelligence's comprehensive understanding of how terrorism functioned not just as military operations, but as integrated systems combining logistics, operations, and propaganda. Disrupting all three simultaneously caused damage that extended beyond the loss of individual leaders. In the decades that followed, the raid was analyzed in military academies and intelligence training programs worldwide as a case study in special operations planning and execution. The use of disguise, the coordination of multiple simultaneous assaults, the precise timing of insertion and evacuation all became reference points for understanding how elite forces can achieve objectives that seem impossible from conventional military perspectives. But for those who participated, the operation remains more than a tactical case study. It represents a moment when they crossed moral boundaries in the service of national security, when they became instruments of state policy that required them to kill dispassionately while dressed in absurd costumes that somehow made the killing both easier and more psychologically complex. The contradictions were never resolved, even decades later, even as they acknowledged the operation's necessity and defended its execution. The evening gowns disposed of at sea, the wigs that helped them pass as women in Beirut's elegant lobbies, the makeup carefully applied before walking in to kill men who would be dead within minutes, all became part of a story Israel would tell about itself and its willingness to do whatever national survival demanded. Whether that story represents triumph or tragedy, whether it demonstrates strength or reveals costs too high to justify, remains a subject of debate among those who lived it and those who study its legacy. The raid stands as a definitive moment where the lines between war and covert action, between justice and vengeance, between tactical brilliance and strategic ambiguity, were drawn in blood on foreign soil, a chapter written by men in women's clothing who walked silently into history. If you found this exploration of one of history's most daring covert operations compelling, please show your support by liking this video. It helps us continue to bring you these detailed accounts. For more deep dives into untold stories of intelligence, special operations, and military history, subscribe to our channel and hit the notification bell so you never miss an update. Share this video with others who appreciate understanding the complex realities behind the headlines. Thank you for watching.